We're in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is a cookbook for priests, for the Kohanim. In the passage from Shemini that Claire will soon read for us and chant for us, we find detailed instructions on how to do the sacrifices, how to prepare the fire to bring into the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. We didn't have the Mishkan yet. It's earlier than the Mishkan. It's boring. We don't care. But in our Torah portion tonight, there's 3 sections of it that stand out. The first is the priests bringing the fire into the Ohel Moed, and Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, the 2 of them bring their fire pan into the Ohel Moed, and we're told in the passage that they had brought an Asarah, a strange fire that God had not commanded. And they were consumed by fire right on the spot. So I looked at Rashi to find out what this Asarah was, and all Rashi said is they were drunk. Seems like a harsh penalty for somebody who's drunk. But that's followed immediately by the passage actually that Claire will chant for us tonight, where the priests are commanded not to get drunk, not have wine, not have liquor before they serve. And I guess if they were drunk, it was a good lesson to learn. And then toward the end of this book, this Shemini, we find that there are the prohibitions and the permissions to eat certain animals. Some of the laws of kashrut come into this Levitical chapter. Toby recently coined a new phrase that I like. In fact, I love. She called herself Jew fluid. Jew fluid. No. That's what I said. Jewish fluid. I mean, there are people who are gender fluid. We might as well have people who are Jewish fluid. I liked it. I liked it because I realized as I heard her say it that we have always been a religion that's fluid. We've never been static. It's never been one kind of a thing all the time. At first, for example, our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the kids, all of them used to sacrifice on some high place somewhere. It didn't make any difference where it was, because all the peoples around them, all the pagans around them, were doing exactly the same thing. They were taking their sacrifices to their gods at a high place and offering them to their gods. Abraham chose to follow only a single God, for a covenant had been made. When we were slaves in Egypt, we learned a new practice. We learned that there were priests. We had no conception of priests before the Egyptian experience. We had no thought that there would be some kind of a hierarchy leading some kind of a worship. But the Egyptians had priests, and they had temples, and they rejoiced at their temples. And so when the children of Israel went out of Egypt, when they went into the desert, lo and behold, we find out that Aaron is the high priest, and his children are going to be priests after him. Something new entirely, something we had never thought of before this moment. And while in this passage we still had the Ohel Moed, we still had the tent of meeting, very soon after we're going to have the Mishkan that's carried from place to place. And there people gathered as the priests, the Kohanim, offered their sacrifices. The priesthood ended when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Because Deuteronomy had said you can only worship in one place, you can only sacrifice in one place. and that was a place that I will show you, which has always been considered to be Jerusalem, the temple. But the temple was destroyed, and the priests had nothing to do. And a new group of people that were coming out of that period of time called the Pharisees, and I understand in Christianity, Pharisees got a really bad rap. But they weren't bad people, they were innovators. They were looking ahead. They realized that something had to happen or the people of Israel would lose any sense of belonging and praying to their God without the temple in Jerusalem. And so a new group of people came out of the Pharisees they called rabbis. Rabbis were not priests. Rabbis would never be able to give a sacrificial worship. When I was ordained, 50-some years ago, my ordination certificate reads with the words, Yoreh, Yoreh, Yadin, Yadin. Shall he teach? Let him teach. Shall he judge? Let him judge. That was all. That was all the rabbi's job, was to teach and to interpret Jewish law. And from that rabbinate came an entire body of literature which we know as the Talmud. And the Talmud often changed the Bible in very subtle ways, but very dramatic ways. Keeping kosher in the Torah, in the Bible, in Leviticus, is very easy. You eat animals that chew the cud and have cleft hoods. You eat only birds that are not singing birds and birds that are not scavengers. Fish have to have scales and fins, so anything good is not on the list. But the rabbis came along and they built a fence around the Torah. And they said, well, later in the Torah it says you shall not cook a kid in the milk of its mother. Well, I got to tell you, I've never done that, okay? You cannot cook a kid in the milk of its mother. And indeed, what happened? You separate milk and meat. You separate the plates. You separate the silverware. You separate the pots. In very strict homes, you separate the sinks. Some even have 2 dishwashers for milchik and fleishik, meat and milk. Sometimes I wonder if that's not an eish zarah that God had not commanded. But that was their protection. If you broke it out here, it wasn't quite as serious as if you ate a kid in the milk of its mother. The Talmud also changed the concept of capital punishment. It's clear in the Torah, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. That's what it says. The rabbis hated the idea of capital punishment. And so they said, okay, well, sure you can, because that's what the Torah says. Sure you can have capital punishment, but you must have 2 eyewitnesses to the crime. Now that's not a big change, because the Torah says, not by the hand of one shall you put to death. What changed was that they had to be eyewitnesses. And then the rabbis came and they said, well, yeah, that's true, but there had to be a sense that the person who was going to do the crime was warned in advance that what that person was going to do was a capital punishment crime. Less likely. And finally they said, if one person objects to the punishment can't take place. And so they dramatically changed the meaning of the Torah to get rid of something that was clearly there. But then fluidity began to end. The Talmud became canonized. It became the Word of God. Instead of a discussion between rabbis and trying to come to a forward-looking decision, the Talmud became static. That became the work. We had the Midrash, but the Midrash wasn't taken all that seriously. The Talmud became the Word of God. And even though the rabbis created the Beit HaKnesset, the house of gathering, the Beit HaTefillah, the house of prayer, Beit HaMidrash, the house of study, all of those things in one, making the synagogue the focal point of prayer for the children of Israel, their movement became stale. The Reform movement was a reaction to that. There was a need to feel more a part of the society in which they lived, which often seems strange, but remember, Abraham worshiped as the pagans did. The children of Israel in the desert worshiped as the Egyptians did. It is not unusual to take practices, if you will, from another people and incorporate them and make them part of your worship. Kashrut seemed unnecessary, and certainly there are still people who keep kosher in the Reform movement. There are people who use the biblical definition of it. But what's different is that they don't do it because they think God's going to strike them dead if they don't. They do it because they want to increase their identity as Jews and remember it each step of the way. Our service is nothing like it was 50-some years ago. Look at me. I'm wearing a talit and a kippah. That was not allowed at Temple Israel when I came as the rabbi. The greatest fight I ever saw in the Board of Trustees was over whether or not we were going to put yarmulkes available for people to take. That was it. That was the whole question. And surprisingly, they said no. Instead, there was a sign above the sanctuary. Some of you remember that sign. It was a little sign so nobody could notice it. And it said, kippot are available by request from the ushers. And there was a secret stash in the closet that only the ushers knew. The service was almost all in English. A few Hebrew songs tossed in here and there just to make it feel good. Certainly the Shema was there. The service now is so different. We chant so much of it. It's in Hebrew. I've got to tell you, I love it. I absolutely love coming to this synagogue and sitting out there, because that's where I'd prefer to be, and joining in song with Cantor Fromson as she leads those prayers so beautifully. It's not only been those negative changes alone that we had. I mean, people say, well, the Reformed Jews don't this, the Reformed Jews don't that, the Reformed Jews deny this or that. No, there's been other changes. The role of women changed dramatically. First, they wanted to be doctors, then they wanted to be lawyers, and my God, then they wanted to be rabbis. What were they ever thinking? But they are rabbis, and now almost half, or sometimes more than half of every class at the Hebrew Union College are made up of women. The acceptance of intermarried couples into the synagogue was a great change, and one that's embraced by, I think, the movement. Same-sex marriage was a big change, and now one that is embraced by, I don't think there is a rabbi left who is not comfortable in doing same-sex weddings. So the key to the Jewish nature is being Jewish fluid, and that's important. Tradition must be considered because take the word Jewish seriously. Look at that tradition. Don't make changes, certainly, just for the sake of making changes without giving it any thought. I would think that to be horrible. We have to bring our knowledge to the text. We have to read the text, Talmud and Torah, with what we know. We know now that dipping somebody into the Jordan River is not going to cure leprosy. And so we don't do that anymore. We know that there are things that medically we know today that they didn't know. And the other thing we know is that Torah in its completion is the human quest to understand the Word of God. And so we must engage in Torah if we're going to stay Jewish fluid. It's not different in our country. The U.S. Constitution should never be static. It has changed. It has been interpreted in many ways. And it's The same is true for Jewish tradition. The Talmud does tell us to live by the commandments and not suffer because of them. So let us weigh our options and embrace Jewish fluidity.